This talk is an examination of the final, and I think still the shortest plateau in 1,000 plateaus, but in a way, what I'm going to try to do here is to try to use it as a kind of, as an optic through which to kind of get a handle on what this book is trying to do, because it's a pretty extraordinary work, and understanding exactly that, it mixes remarkably sophisticated conceptual abstraction with a series of what seem to be practical, ethical and aesthetic imperatives. And I want to try to understand the articulation of these two dimensions of the book. And I think this articulation is explicitly stated in the title of this final plateau, Concrete Rules and Abstract Machines. So what relation between the abstract and the concrete is at issue here? In other words, how do rules relate to machines? And the term rule is unusual, especially for, Deleuze and Guattari, given their antipathy to any kind of, to Kantianism and to any kind of rationalist universalism. So the word rule here is being used in a very peculiar sense. Okay, and I'm going to try to hopefully kind of elucidate that sense. In order to understand the relationship between rules, concrete rules, and abstract machines, we need to clarify the parameters within which this work operates. And the key to do this is to understand that Deleuze and Guattari's materialism is neither a contemplative representation of an objectively existing material reality, nor, on the other hand, a series of practical imperatives that presupposes, yet disavows, a theoretical representation of material reality. In other words, when you're conjuring prescriptions about what to do or how you should act, it seems that there's often, there's a kind of a surreptitious invocation of theory. There's some kind of conceptual theorization which is implicit. And it seems to me that Deleuze and Guattari want to be explicit about the articulation of both dimensions. So for all its idiosyncrasy, ATP conforms to a classical model of philosophy. It's a very classical work, where an ontology, understood as the account of what there is at one with ethics, understood as a practice or art of living. And Deleuze's work on Spinoza, I'm sure everyone is familiar with the proper Deleuzean understanding of ethics, okay, as opposed to any kind of Kantian moral philosophy. But this is not to say that it's a traditional or conservative work. It's a contemporary reactivation of the classical task of philosophizing, which is the fusion of understanding what there is, what exists in the world, and how to live, what we should do. What are the stakes of this reactivation? It fuses an abstract materialism, wherein matter is conceived independently of form, with a concrete ethics, where action is selected independently of universal law. But how can concrete practices engage formless matter? Okay, now I'll hopefully try to explain what this formlessness, why abstract matter is necessarily formless in Deleuze and Guattari. This is another way of asking about the nature of the distinction between the abstract and the concrete. Abstract, as I'll try to show, means unformed, but the unformed is endowed with positive traits of its own. So abstract matter is described as constituting a plane of consistency characterized by continuums of intensities, particle signs, and deterritorialized flows. And this vocabulary is very precise, and actually rereading this book, I'm struck by its precision. It's a book that seems intimidatingly, dense and complex, and there's a profusion of concepts and distinctions. But what's striking when one rereads the book is the consistency and precision with which Deleuze and Guattari use this vocabulary. They use these terms in a very, very precise and consistent way from beginning to end. Okay. Finally, the plane of consistency must be made. It's not given. And all the injunctions about, from the very beginning of the rhizome plateau, le multiple, il faut le faire, the multiple must be made. It's not given. But consistency is not attained through abstraction, by abstracting from the inconsistent or empirical multiplicity, but by diagramming what is most concrete in both thinking and doing. So concrete means practical. That's one sense in which I think concrete rules must be understood here. Recognizing and releasing the positive traits characteristic of the unformed is a practical matter, and one that is moreover constrained by certain rules. What sorts of rules? Because real or abstract matter cannot be represented within material reality, the rules or practical injunctions governing the constructions of the real, the plane of consistency, cannot be read off some pre-existing reality. So these rules will be concrete precisely to the extent that they effectuate the abstract. So practice and theory realize one another. Theoretical concepts are effectuated in practice. Practical imperatives are formulated in theory. So this project then can be understood as a radicalization of philosophical pragmatics. And indeed, it characterizes philosophy as a whole. Pragmatics is one of their terms for describing what it is they're doing. But it's a pragmatics where neither the agents nor the function of practices can be taken for granted. The reference of the communal we, constantly invoked both by traditional pragmatists and neo-pragmatists, a la Rorty, is a starting point whose epistemic authority and socio-historical coordinates will be gradually disassembled and replaced by another we, that of a minoritarian people to come. And by the same token, the habitual functions and goals established around this existing we, the goals and purposes that we prescribe for ourselves, according to our current understanding of the world, need to be suspended. Normal functioning and established finalities need to be disrupted. But this disruption cannot be immediately achieved. Since we always start in the middle, we start stratified, organized, subjectified. Thus, a practical challenge is to understand how we can de-stratify, disorganize, and desubjectify without lapsing into religious self-abnegation. Or, to quote Guattari, to reach not the point where one no longer says I, but the point where it is no longer of any importance whether one says I. But why would this point of apparent indifference between owning or abnegating one's subjectivity be worth reaching? If such a point is worth reaching, it cannot be indifferent to this difference. It's not a point of, this blank identity. The white knight or the black knight. Something must be retained, something of the subject, something of the sign, something of the organism. This is a quote. That which races or dances upon the plane of consistency thus carries with it the aura of its stratum, an undulation, a memory, or attention. The plane of consistency retains just enough of the strata to extract from them variables that operates in the plane of consistency as its own functions. So, now what I'm going to propose, or my hypothesis, is that what will be retained from stratified function on the plane of consistency is the torsion of de-stratified intensities, particles, signs, and flows, the traits, the components of the plane of consistency. But because the point of torsion is indiscernible from the vantage of anyone invested in the importance of a distinction between self and non-self, or personal and impersonal, its approach requires caution. Caution is required for the composition of the plane of consistency, and it's obviously one of the watchwords of 1,000 Platos. So this is the point at which concrete rules for the composition of consistency become relevant. To understand how concrete rules are articulated with abstract machines, we have to understand how the composition of consistency, according to rules, requires deformalizing stratified functions and subjecting them to the torsion of absolute movement. And this is a quote from the Concrete Rules, Plato. Quote, a movement is absolute when, whatever its quantity and speed, it relates a body, considered as multiple, to a smooth space that it occupies in the manner of a vortex. Okay, and I think the claim vortex here is crucial. They mean torsion is a measure of, or torque actually, is a measure of the this movement, this twisting movement that tornadoes exhibit, for instance. And it seems that this is what deformalization or destratification on the plane of consistency does. It twists elements from stratified functions from the three fundamental strata. Physical, chemical, biological, and anthropomorphic. So, absolute movement then is attained through the deformalization of stratified function. Deformalization ensures the continuity of intensities, the emission of particle signs, and the combination or conjunctions of deterritorialized flows on the plane of consistency. And once again, continuity, intensive continuity, emission, particle emission, and combination of flows are consistent. These are the terms they use over and over again for these, constructions of absolute movement. So, abstract then means de or unformed, which ultimately means destratified. And I think stratification is the source of all formalization. So this is why I think the geology of morals plateau, the third plateau, is absolutely crucial to understanding the whole book. And I think it gives the lie to the claim, Deleuze and Guattari's claim, that the plateaus can be read in any order. That's not true. If you don't read, if you haven't understood the plateau, the geology of morals plateau, as I learned to my cost, it's very hard to understand what they mean in the other plateaus. So I think that stratification is absolutely crucial to understanding decoding and deterritorialization, precisely as these operations already presuppose stratification. Stratic synthesis is absolutely primary. Okay. What is stratification? Okay, so it's a forbiddingly, it's one of the most complicated and demanding sections of the entire book, but I'll try to give a kind of a very quick gloss on it. Stratification is the double articulation of content and expression, as I'm sure you all know. So, this double articulation is the condition of all order, structure, and regularity. But stratification is complex. Both the articulation of content and that of expression are bifurcated. Okay, and I'll just use the kind of physical stratum as an example of this double articulation. At the elementary physical level, content is articulated by splitting material flows into successively coordinated molecular units, so that molecular substance is formally coordinated. So this is the substance and form of content. Okay. Content has a form and a substance. Okay. Expression, on the other hand, is articulated by establishing, quoting Deleuze and Guattari, functional, compact, stable structures, and by constructing molar compounds onto which these structures are superimposed. So, molar compounds are formally structured. This is the substance and form of expression. Okay. So this is just beginning at the the physical chemical level. It gets the plateau then moves on to characterize the procedures of stratification in first of all in the biological domain, and then ultimately in the anthropomorphic realm. Now, stratified content is formed matter, and stratified expression is structured function. So that all stratification is the articulation of formed matter and structured function. In other words, you form a matter and you make it do something. Okay, stratification is materialization or substantialization, if you want, and then the functionalization, the physical or organic or linguistic functionalization of that form matter. Both articulations are segmented, and the bi-univocal relations between segments of content or formed matters and segments of expression or structured functions are the source of every real structure, whether physical, biological, or socio-political. So material reality comprises three fundamental types of strata: physical-chemical, biological, and anthropomorphic, or, as those Brassier puts it, allomorphic. Allomorphic because anthropomorphic strata have the power to colonize all the others. Okay. Only the first stratum, the physical-chemical, gives molar expression to molecular content. Biological and allomorphic contents are not necessarily molecular, nor are their expressions necessarily molar. This is something they insist upon. Now, you have to see, I think here, this, in reference to the debates about what kind of philosophical work A Thousand Plateaus is, I think the answer to the question about whether this is some kind of extension of some critical transcendental project, in other words, whether it's some kind of eccentric transcendental phenomenology, or whether it is in fact a work of metaphysics, is the latter. This is, and the answer is, if you understand that stratification is a real process. In fact, reality as such is constituted through stratification. Reality in the sense of the reality investigated by representable reality, the reality that is cognizably tractable, as opposed to the real understood as the plane of consistency. So stratification is a process of division, such that strata shatter the continuums of intensity, introducing breaks between different strata and within each stratum. But this division is real, not ideal. It's not dialectical. It's not in our heads. It's not a function of representation. The strata are real. Okay? Strata split and segment, but they also conjoin and connect. So D&G time and again insist on the real as opposed to the formal distinction between content and expression. They use real in a scholastic sense. A real distinction is a distinction in existence, when you distinguish two independently existing things, whereas a formal distinction is a merely kind of conceptual distinction. Okay. Stratification then is a real synthesis establishing a common root for expressive form and expressed content. So there's an isomorphism between content and expression. Again, it's another quote. Their independence does not preclude isomorphism. In other words, the existence of the same kind of constant relations between segments of content and segments of expression on both sides. This isomorphism makes a stratification an instance of divine judgment. Okay? And when they say divine judgment, they mean divine as opposed to human judgment or cognitive judgment. When they say that strata are judgments of God, they mean judgments of God in the absolute sense, as if God's thinking makes the world, okay, God's judgment, his articulations of subjects and predicates, constitutes cognizable reality. Okay? So what they're saying is that, synthesis, it's not a function of transcendental subjectivity. It's not a function of some kind of not human, but kind of impersonal transcendental subject or thinker. Synthesis is actually deployed through matter is self-synthesizing. Okay, so that's why it has an ontological as opposed to a cognitive significance. And this is another quote. Indeed, the significance of the doctrine of synthetic judgment, by which I think they mean Kant, okay, is to have demonstrated that there is an a priori link or isomorphism between sentence and figure, or linguistic expression and form bodies, a form of expression and a form of content. Okay, so real distinction, reciprocal presupposition, and isomorphy are the characteristics of stratic synthesis. So, why? Because stratification is both something that splits and separates, but it also joins and unites. Okay? And that's what double articulation does. You divide, but then you connect at the same time. The alternative to stratic synthesis is not analysis, the formal disintegration of the abstract and the concrete, but another kind of synthesis, which is to say, an alternative intrication of the abstract and the concrete, or form and matter, if you want. This synthesis is not cognitive but practical. okay, and it unfolds as what Deleuze called the diagramming of the junction between non-formal functions and unformed matters. Here's another quote, okay, from the final Plato. Abstract machines consist of unformed matters and non-formal functions. Every abstract machine is a consolidated aggregate of matters, functions, phylum and diagram, machinic phylum and rhizomatic diagram. This is evident on a technological plane. Such a plane is not made up simply of formed substances, aluminium, plastic, electric wire, etc., or organizing forms, program, prototypes, etc., but of a composites of unformed matters exhibiting only degrees of intensity, resistance, conductivity, heating, stretching, speed or delay, induction, transduction, and diagrammatic functions exhibiting only differential equations or more generally tensors. So in a way, what they mean by a non-formal function is something like a machine diagram or a wiring diagram, where a wiring diagram is a kind of connects elements, okay, material elements, okay, but the way in which those elements are connected, in other words, the engineering of these elements, their consolidation, doesn't have a logical structure, okay? It's not a purely it's not logically formalizable, okay? But nor is it simply empirical, okay? It's not simply a series of connections between empirically tractable properties or things like behavioral dispositions, okay? So, tensors then are the operators of torsion through which deformalization composes intensities, sign particles, and flows on the plane of consistency. What does this mean? It simply means that deformalization diagrams this kind of the relationship between these elements of an assemblage, okay, but liberates them from their stratic articulation. Okay? It disarticulates them to construct the diagram, okay, but a diagram which is functional but non-formalizable. Okay, so diagrammatic composition is the identification of these points of torsion. Okay, but this composition requires concrete rules. Again, there are rules of planning or of diagramming, as we will later see, or elsewhere. The abstract machine is not random. The continuities of intensities, emissions of particles and combinations of flows do not occur in just any fashion. So, it's the rules of, the French would be planification, Massumi has planing. Actually, if you think of it like, a carpenter planes a surface, that's what it means to create a plane of consistency. It's the planing which generates, a surface, okay? That ensure consistency, it's these rules that ensure consistency, not decoding, deterritorialization or destratification as such. This is very important. Decoding, deterritorialization, and destratification are not simply, it's not stuff that is just going on, it's stuff that is going on around us all the time. But what they're saying is that the kind of destratification that they're interested in, okay, the kind of destratification that has to be effected, okay, is rule governed, okay. So they're saying that there is something to be done, okay. This is where the practical dimension is, and the point is that once you recognize when you're diagramming an assemblage, you're supposed to identify, you have to do something when you're diagramming it in order to understand what you can then do to push this configuration, this machinic assemblage, into another state. Okay? So these rules extract deformalized functions from strata. Quote again, the plane of consistency is occupied, drawn by the abstract machine. The abstract machine exists simultaneously developed on the destratified plane, it draws, and enveloped in each stratum whose unity of composition it defines. Okay. Now, this distinction between development and envelopment is also, I think, crucial. Okay. So it's concrete rules then that effectuate the abstract. Okay. This is the claim I'm making. Okay. In other words, this is why it's not. They're not simply kind of describing the world. They're not describing the functioning or the kind of the coordination of reality. Okay? They're diagramming it, and these diagrams are designed to give you a point of traction. They're supposed to allow you to do something in the world. That's what concrete rules are for. And what these concrete rules do is that they develop the abstract machines enveloped in the strata. This development hinges upon the distinction between stratification and assemblage, agencement. Okay? Because stratification is the precondition for every machinic assemblage, and assemblages are at once territorial and deterritorializing, assemblage then is a practical condition for the development of the abstract. And this is obvious in French. Agencer is a verb. It means to assemble. Okay. So, concrete assemblages develop abstract machines. And planification or planing is the concrete development of the enveloped abstract. It cuts across physical, biological, and anthropomorphic strata to compose unformed matters, anorganic life, and non-human becomings. So, then, the suggestion is that rules of destratification just means rules of, planification, which just means the development of the enveloped. So, now, the second relevant factor, to understand this, how this development, this practical development of the abstract can be brought about, is by understanding the relationship between abstraction and variation. Abstraction is a function of variation. Here's another quote. Abstract does not mean universal, ideal, or eternal. It is a function of variation. Quote, there is no reason to tie the abstract to the universal or the constant, or to face the singularity of abstract machines, insofar as they are constructed around variables and variations. That's why abstract machines are functions of variation. So, concrete rules then are tensors of continuous variations. A concrete rule allows you to put something to a state of continuous variation. Okay? Quote again. Constant is not opposed to variable. It is a treatment of the variable opposed to the other kind of treatment, or continuous variation. So-called obligatory rules correspond to the first kind of treatment. The obligatory rules distinguish between constants and variables, and in fact, the kind of moral universalism or practical, or practicism that Deleuze and Guattari are attacking thinks it's always possible to identify an invariance, a formal invariance, across a variety of different empirical circumstances. Okay, this is another kind of residue of hylomorphism. The idea that you can have invariant form and kind of variable content. Okay. So obligatory rules presuppose this. They presuppose a distinction between variable and invariant. Okay. Whereas optional rules concern the construction of a continuum of variations. That's why concrete rules must be optional. So, now, Deleuze and Guattari give at least two hints at hints at two ways in which these concrete rules can be kind of delineated or kind of characterized, okay? First of all, it's a question of understanding the way in which an assemblage is a conjoining of a saying and a doing. A machinic assemblage conjoins saying and doing. Okay. a regime of enunciation, and form bodies. Okay. So the first axis, there's a first axis in terms of which one can characterize rules of assemblage, concrete rules of assemblage. And by asking the questions, which content and which expression, what kind of content is developed here and what kind of expression, which regime of signs, which system of bodies. So in each case, it's necessary to ascertain both what is said and what is done. Okay? That's the first axis of evaluation for concrete rules. The second axis is asked, what are the cutting edges of deterritorialization? What abstract machines do they effectuate? And here's a quote. Okay. The concrete rules of assemblage thus operate along these two axes. On the one hand, what is the territoriality of the assemblage? What is the regime of signs and the pragmatic system? On the other hand, what are the cutting edges of deterritorialization and what abstract machines do they effectuate? So, diagramming lets us see to what extent a line of flight is destratificatory or liberatory, but this diagramming or this assessment is going to be for us. Okay, the point. Look at the questions you're asking when you're diagramming an assemblage. Okay. What is the territoriality of the assemblage? What is the regime of signs in the pragmatic system? What are the cutting edges of deterritorialization and what abstract machines do they effectuate? Okay? So the question, it's not clear, at least whether the answers to these questions are, they're explicitly perspectival. Okay? How you answer these questions will depend on what kind of body you have, what kind of assemblages you are connected with or participating in. So, in effect, that's why there's no kind of, value, absolutes or kind of neutral standpoint for this kind of, this work of diagramming according to rules. So, in effect, consistency proceeding by consolidation acts necessarily in the middle, by the middle, and stands opposed to all planes of principle or finality. In other words, the ways in which the concrete rules are put into practice, identified and put into practice, okay, depends upon variable circumstances. Because you're always acting in a, it's tempting to use the language of particularity here, particularity or contingency. But of course, this is a very vocabulary that becomes redundant in Deleuze-Guattari's framework. Okay? You can no longer oppose the necessary and the contingent, or the universal and the particular. Okay? So, now, I'm not going to read the whole of this quote, but once again, I want to point, I've just highlighted the two crucial sections where they emphasize the way in which concrete rules are rules of selection, rules of discrimination, if you want. Okay? The plane of consistency is like, Masumi has role. The French is enfilade. And enfilade, I learned recently, it's like in 18th century houses, 18th century kind of houses of the French aristocracy, you'd have one door, a series of rooms that were connected by doors, okay? And they weren't joined by any kind of corridor. There's a door that leads you from one room straight into another room. So an enfilade of doors is a series of chambers, if you want, that are serially connected to one another, okay? And that's how we're to envisage the articulation of the plane of consistency, okay? These are thresholds, intensive thresholds, okay? But the concrete rules for the construction of the plane obtain to the extent that they exercise a selective role, okay? And I'm just going to skip to the last sentence. So, what is selected for? What is retained and preserved, and therefore created, what consists is only that which increases the number of connections at each level of division or composition, thus in descending as well as ascending order, that which cannot be divided without changing in nature, or enter into a larger composition without requiring a new criterion of comparison. So the key thing is that the link between selection, okay, you're selecting those elements which increase the number of connections at each level of division. Okay. Thus there's a whole process of selection of assemblages according to their ability to draw a plane of consistency with an increasing number of connections. Okay. This is why schizoanalysis is not only a qualitative analysis of abstract machines in relation to the assemblages, but also a quantitative analysis of the assemblages in relation to a presumably pure abstract machine. Okay. Now, it's this actually kind of second clause which I think is curious or becomes perplexing. Because the rules of selection are always articulated on the anthropomorphic or alloplastic strata, which, Guattari said, are particularly propitious for the assemblages. Okay, and again, I won't read the whole of the quote. I'll just read the final sentence. On the one hand, the anthropomorphic strata are propitious to machinic assemblages, and there seem to be, they insist that there are greater, again, I can't use the word possibility. There are greater kind of, capacities for deterritorialization in the allomorphic strata than in the physical, chemical, or even biological strata. Okay, but at the same time, but they want to say this, but Deleuze and Guattari disavow what they call any ridiculous cosmic evolutionism. Okay, it's not even, it's against the bad interpretation of Bergson, where you would have something like a cosmic evolution, a kind of an ascent of stages, an increased, complexification, intensification, etc., let alone something like, the Chardin Omega point, okay? So on the one hand, they want to disavow any kind of convergence. There's no convergence. There's no final destination for becoming, okay? Yet at the same time, the allomorphic strata are particularly propitious for the assemblages. They allow a greater degree of deterritorialization. Okay. So the question is, how do you measure degrees of deterritorialization? Well, you measure them with regard to a presumably pure abstract machine. Okay. And what is a presumably pure abstract machine? Okay. Well, it's only comprehensible if you take the theory of stratification absolutely seriously. The only way in which it's possible to identify the pure abstract machine, okay, the pure abstract machine is that which is entirely developed, okay, which is not, or rather which is somehow not, compromised by envelopment in a strata, or no longer provides a kind of a center of unity. Now, I think there's a tension here between these two claims, okay? It's not clear what a pure abstract machine could be, okay? If the selection of destratified traits, intensities, particle signs, flows, operates according to criteria discernible only from within the anthropomorphic strata, in other words, if it's only from the anthropomorphic strata that you can measure the degrees of proximity to the pure abstract machine, has our composition of consistency not re-enveloped the abstract in the concrete? Have we not absolutely relativized the absolute? Okay? We were supposed to absolutize relativity, okay, according to Deleuze. But it's not clear in which this articulation of relative and absolute, or in fact the identification of something like absolute movement on the plane of consistency, which is a necessary component for destratification, is strictly kind of available to Deleuze and Guattari, given the terms given the pragmatic remit which they set themselves. Okay? And then, I'm just going to end here. So then the question is, does machinic pragmatism, if this is the case then, does machinic pragmatism not risk lapsing into its more prosaic cousin, liberal pragmatism? Okay? Because the question then is, if, okay, the question of machinic pragmatism is also how to, how can I act in such a way as to facilitate degrees, the construction of plane of consistency, okay? How can, I recognize those machinic traits which are deterritorializing, decoding, intensificatory, but in a way which is, which facilitates the consolidation of consistency. The question is, the role of concrete rules makes the evaluation of the consolidation of consistency relative to, well, to who? To who? Because we're always stratified, subjectified, territorialized, okay? And we're trying to identify those points that are, at which we can kind of deterritorialize, but in a cautious, creative, constructive way. Okay? So then, the kind of the, by enforcing, the more you enforce the immanence of the criteria of evaluation, or the more you insist on the necessary concretion of the rules, then the more it becomes difficult to say, well, who's going to tell you whether or not something is deterritorializing, intensificatory, destratificatory? Who gets to say? Okay, okay, that's it.
We're happy to stand for the